The rifle crack split the morning air as the first target exploded into splinters at 600 yards. Then the second, then the third, fourth, and fifth, each one disintegrating in rapid succession, while the crowd of ranchers, military officers, and skeptics stood frozen in disbelief. The man lowering his rifle wasn't holding some expensive German rangefinder or precision surveying equipment. Gripped in his weathered left hand was a pine board smaller than a schoolbook, with 2 bent nails hammered through it at measured intervals. The officers who'd been laughing 5 minutes earlier weren't laughing anymore. The year was 1917, and Thomas Edwin Harker had just proved that 2 cents of scrap metal could outperform $50 of imported brass and glass, that poverty and clear thinking could humiliate wealth and arrogance, and that sometimes the most sophisticated solution is the simplest one nobody thought to try. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Thomas Harker was born in 1881 in a Kansas sod house to parents who'd survived the Civil War only to face starvation during the grasshopper plagues that devoured the Great Plains. His father, Jonathan Harker, had been a Union sharpshooter at Chattanooga, one of those lean farm boys who could drop a Confederate officer at 400 yards with an Enfield rifle and iron sights. But Jonathan came home with a shattered shoulder from a mini-ball that never properly healed, and the precision that made him valuable in war became worthless in peace. The Harker family drifted westward with the land rushes, always one failed crop from destitution, always surviving on ingenuity, because cash money was something other people had. Young Thomas learned to read by candlelight using newspaper scraps that lined their walls for insulation. He learned mathematics helping his father survey fence lines with knotted rope and the angles of shadows. He learned that expensive tools belonged to rich men, and rich men rarely understood what poor men could accomplish when desperation met intelligence. By 16, Thomas carried the weight of feeding his family. His father's shoulder had deteriorated until he could barely lift a bucket, leaving the boy responsible for putting meat on the table. The problem that would define Thomas's life emerged immediately. The Kansas prairie offered visibility for miles, but game was scarce and impossibly wary. Antelope could detect movement at extraordinary distances. Deer vanished at the first hint of danger. To hunt successfully, Thomas needed to shoot at ranges his father's generation would have considered absurd. 300 yards, 400, sometimes more. Miss at those distances, and you've spooked every animal within a square mile. Wound something and let it suffer and run, and you'd wasted precious ammunition for nothing but guilt. The Harkers couldn't afford to miss. Cartridges cost money they didn't have. Every single shot had to count, had to mean the difference between eating and going hungry. The fundamental problem was ancient. How do you know the exact distance to your target? Army marksmen use expensive rangefinders, optical instruments with ground lenses that measure distance through triangulation. Surveyors use transits and measuring chains. Artillery officers consulted mathematical tables and careful observation. But all these methods required equipment that cost more than the Harkers earned in 6 months. Thomas tried everything. He attempted to judge distance by apparent size, but prairie air played tricks with perspective. He tried pacing off landmarks and memorizing terrain features, but animals never appeared exactly where he'd measured. He tried Kentucky windage, that old rifleman's art of estimating holdover by instinct, but instinct fed nobody when it guessed wrong. For 3 years, he burned through their ammunition supply with barely enough success to keep his family fed, watching his father grow thinner and his mother's face grow more deeply lined with worry that never spoke itself aloud. Then in the winter of 1898, everything changed. Thomas was 17, hired as a local guide for a traveling surveyor named Clarence Whitmore, a Boston-educated engineer mapping potential railroad routes. Whitmore treated frontier families with barely concealed contempt, but paid cash for guides who knew the territory. For 2 weeks, Thomas watched the man use expensive equipment. A theodolite for angles, a surveyor's chain for distance, and most fascinating of all, a rangefinder using 2 mirrors and a mechanical calculator to determine how far away landmarks stood. One evening at their creekside camp, Thomas asked how the rangefinder worked. Whitmore laughed with that particular condescension educated men, reserved for those they consider hopelessly ignorant, say it was far too complex for someone without mathematical training. But whiskey made him talkative, and eventually he explained the basic principle. If you know the distance between two observation points and measure the angle to a distant object from each point, simple trigonometry gives you the distance to that object. The farther apart your observation points, the more accurate your measurement. Thomas lay awake that night working through the implications. The principle was just geometry, the kind he'd learned helping his father with fence lines. You didn't need expensive mirrors or mechanical calculators. You needed two fixed observation points, a way to measure angles, and basic arithmetic. A man's arm length was roughly consistent. Hold a stick at arm's length. Use marks on that stick to measure angles, and you could calculate distance. If you took two observations from slightly different positions, you could triangulate. The rangefinder wasn't magic. It was geometry made portable. The question was whether that geometry could be simplified enough, made cheap enough, made practical enough for a desperate homesteader to actually use. It took 3 months of failures to make it work. His first version used a stick with 2 notches, but the notches were too crude for consistent measurements. His second used a board with 2 nails placed too close together, making angle differences too small to measure accurately. His third used nails too far apart, making it impossible to keep both aligned while sighting. He burned through paper-making calculations, checking the trigonometry, accounting for arm length, eye spacing, nail thickness. His father watched these experiments with the patient sadness of a man who'd seen too many desperate schemes fail. His mother probably thought he was losing his mind. But Thomas had seen the principle work with Whitmore's expensive equipment. He knew it was possible. The question was execution. The breakthrough came in April 1899. Thomas carved a pine board exactly 12 inches long and 4 inches wide, sanded smooth. He measured his arm length precisely, 24 inches from either fist when fully extended. He drove 2 finishing nails through the board at precisely calculated positions, bending them at right angles, so they pointed toward him when he held the board at arm's length. The nails were separated by exactly 3 inches. When he held the board at arm's length and looked past the 2 nail tips, they created sight lines diverging at a known angle. The elegant twist. By taking 2 observations from positions exactly 10 feet apart and noting where each nail aligned with the target, the geometry let him calculate distance regardless of the target size. No need to know how big the animal was. Just observations, positions, and arithmetic. The first test was on a fence post he'd measured at 300 yards. His calculation came out to 304 yards, close enough to make his hands shake. He tested again and again on trees, rocks, fence lines he'd paced or measured with rope. The results clustered within 5 to 10 yards of true distance, even beyond 500 yards. It worked. 2 bent nails on a pine board, combined with simple arithmetic and careful observation, could match what Whitmore's $50 rangefinder accomplished. That evening, Thomas took his father's rifle to a ridge where antelope sometimes grazed. When a small herd appeared, he ranged them at 430 yards using his nail board. He knew the ballistics. The .40-65 Winchester dropped approximately 60 inches at 400 yards. He adjusted his aim accordingly, settled the crosshairs high on a buck's shoulder, and squeezed. The antelope dropped instantly. His father cried when Thomas brought the meat home, not just from relief that they'd eat, but because his son had thought his way past a problem that poverty had no business solving. Word spread slowly. Neighbors noticed Thomas Harker wasted fewer shots. When asked, he showed them the nail board, explained the principle, demonstrated the arithmetic. Some men nodded and made their own versions. Others laughed, calling it Harker's fool stick, and insisting real marksmen didn't need gadgets. But the men who laughed were often the same men who burned through ammunition with little to show for it, while men who adopted the technique started shooting more successfully. Over the next decade, as Thomas married, started his own homestead in Wyoming, and became known as one of the most consistently successful hunters in the region, the nail-board rangefinder became a quiet fixture among practical riflemen who cared more about results than appearance. It wasn't pretty. It didn't impress city folk. But it worked, and in country where working mattered more than looking sophisticated, that was enough. Then came 1917 and the Great War. The United States entered the conflict in April, and suddenly the nation needed riflemen. The Army organized marksmanship competitions across the West. searching for men who could shoot accurately at extended ranges. Modern trench warfare had demonstrated that combat often required engaging targets at distances traditional Army training barely addressed. Machine gun nests at 800 yards. Observer posts at 1,000 yards. British and German armies had developed specialized sniper programs. Americans, arriving late, needed to catch up quickly. Officers fanned out to ranching communities and frontier towns, looking for men with real shooting skills that exceeded what rifle ranges could teach. In July, a competition was announced for Sweetwater County, Wyoming. A $1,000 prize and guaranteed selection for advanced marksmanship training for any civilian who could outshoot the Army's demonstration team at ranges from 200 to 800 yards. Thomas Harker was 36, probably too old for frontline service, but eligible for specialized training roles. More importantly, his family desperately needed that $1,000. 3 children, a homestead that barely broke even in good years, and the kind of financial pressure that kept men awake at night. He registered for the competition, arriving at the designated ranch outside Rock Springs on a blazing August morning with his father's old Winchester and the pine board with 2 bent nails. The scene was elaborate and intimidating. The Army had brought proper optical rangefinders, surveying equipment, and spotting scopes. 3 Army marksmen in crisp uniforms demonstrated their equipment and technique for the assembled crowd. Perhaps 40 civilian competitors had gathered, some with expensive rifles and hand-loaded ammunition, others like Thomas with working guns and factory cartridges. The format was straightforward: targets at 200, 400, 600, and 800 yards. Each shooter got 2 spotting shots at each distance to just aim, followed by 5 shots for score. Highest total score won. The trouble started during equipment inspection. An Army lieutenant named Morrison noticed Thomas's nail board and asked what it was. When Thomas explained it was a rangefinder, Morrison laughed out loud. He called over fellow officers and several competitors to look at what he termed the cowboy's toy. One newspaperman, sensing a story, asked Thomas to demonstrate. Thomas obliged, holding the board at arm's length, taking observations on a distant marker flag, calculating with a pencil stub on scrap paper. His result, 615 yards. Morrison used the Army's optical rangefinder, a beautiful brass instrument that probably cost more than Thomas's horse, and announced the official distance, 608 yards. Close enough that Morrison's smile faded slightly, but he recovered quickly, saying even a stop clock was right twice a day. The nickname stuck immediately. Thomas became Two-Nail Harker, and his device became Harker's Two-Nail Wonder. The mockery was good-natured, but real. City men, educated officers. Even some competitors treated him like a country bumpkin who didn't understand that real precision required real tools. Shooting began at 200 yards, where range finding barely mattered and experience was everything. Thomas shot well, but not spectacularly. 42 points out of 50. Several shooters matched or exceeded that. The Army men shot with mechanical precision, clustering their groups impressively. At 400 yards, the field began separating. This was where range finding started mattering, where a 50-yard error meant missing completely. Thomas used his nail board, calculated 412 yards, adjusted accordingly, and put 4 of 5 scoring shots into the black. 46 points. Excellent shooting, but 2 Army marksmen shot better. Morrison, watching through a spotting scope, made a show of announcing each of Thomas's hits with exaggerated surprise, as if amazed the nail board worked at all. The crowd enjoyed the theater. The countryman with his homemade gadget holding his own against trained military shooters with professional equipment. But 600 yards was where everything changed. At that distance, ballistics became brutal and unforgiving. A 10-yard range error meant a 12-inch impact error. A 20-yard error put you completely off target. Wind drift became significant. Bullet trajectory curvature meant holdover calculations needed precision. The Army shooters went first, using their optical rangefinder to establish distance at exactly 587 yards. They consulted printed ballistics tables, adjusted sights, and fired spotting shots. Results were mixed. One man put both spotters into the target. Another hit with one and missed completely with the other. When scoring shots came, performance was respectable but not dominant. Scores of 38, 41, and 39. Good shooting, but even trained men struggled at this distance. Several civilian competitors fared worse. Bullets striking yards away. Range estimates clearly wrong. 2 men scratched after their spotters revealed they weren't even close. Thomas stepped to the line with his worn Winchester and pine board. He took his first observation, walked exactly 10 feet to the side as heads turned to watch this unusual procedure, took his second observation, and performed his calculations. He announced to the range officer, 592 yards. The crowd murmured. Morrison made a comment about how the nail expert had somehow gotten further from the correct distance than the Army's precision instrument. Thomas said nothing. He adjusted his sight for 592 yards, settled into position, and fired his first spotter. The bullet struck high and right of center. He adjusted for wind, fired his second spotter, and hit just left of the bullseye. The crowd quieted. That was uncommonly good spotting. For his 5 scoring shots, Thomas entered a state of focus that blocked everything out. Heat, watching crowd, Morrison's skepticism, his family's financial need. He controlled his breathing, felt wind on his face, calculated the fractional adjustment needed, and pressed the trigger with steady patience. First shot hit center mass. Second shot hit center mass. Third shot hit center mass. Fourth shot hit just outside center, but well within scoring rings. Fifth shot hit center mass. The silence was absolute. 47 points out of 50 at 600 yards, with 4 or 5 shots in or near the bullseye. The range officer, a grizzled sergeant with 40 years of service, walked down to check the target personally, as if he couldn't trust the spotters. When he returned and announced the score officially, the crowd erupted in astonished applause. Morrison's face had gone carefully neutral. One Army shooter, a corporal from Montana, who'd been friendly earlier, walked over and asked to examine the nail board. Thomas handed it over, explaining the geometry, the calculation method, the need for precise arm extension and careful observation. The corporal studied it seriously. No mockery now, asking intelligent questions about parallax error and angular measurement. He handed it back with something like respect in his eyes, saying he'd never seen anything like it but couldn't argue with results. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. The competition continued to 800 yards, where even small errors became catastrophic. Wind had picked up, adding complexity. Army shooters went first, and increased range revealed limits even of their training. One man scored 32 points. Another scored 28. The third, clearly rattled by Thomas's 600-yard performance, scored only 24. The civilian field largely collapsed at this distance. Men who'd shot confidently at closer ranges found themselves missing 6-foot targets entirely. One competitor fired all 7 shots, including spotters, and hit only twice. Another gave up after his spotters revealed completely wrong elevation. By the time Thomas stepped to the line, the competition had essentially narrowed to him versus the Army's best total across all distances. Matched the Army corporal's total, and $1,000 was his. Fall short, and he'd go home with nothing but the memory of briefly embarrassing some officers. He went through his ranging procedure again, walking his 10-foot offset, taking observations, calculating. The crowd watched in silence now, mockery burned away by demonstrated competence. Thomas announced 794 yards. Set his sight for that distance plus careful wind correction he could feel on his face, and settled into position. At 800 yards, his father's Winchester was reaching the outer limits of effective range. The bullet would drop over 20 feet, from bore line to target. Wind drift could push it several feet laterally. Tiny errors in aim, trigger control, or calculation would magnify into complete misses. His spotting shots both hit the target but scattered wide, showing him just how marginal his accuracy was at this distance. For an ordinary shooter, this was prayer. For Thomas, it was mathematics and mechanics carried to their practical limit. He made his corrections, found his focus, and fired his 5 scoring rounds with the same patient precision he'd shown at 600 yards. First shot hit high left. Second shot hit low right. Third shot hit near center. Fourth shot missed the scoring area entirely, striking the target frame. Fifth shot hit center left. When the range officer tallied the result, 31 points. Thomas had done what nobody expected. Matched the Army's best performance at a distance, where his equipment should have been hopelessly outclassed. Final scores were calculated with the crowd pressing close. Thomas Harker, 166 points total. Best Army shooter, 158 points. Nearest civilian competitor, 151 points. The rancher who'd organized the competition, a man named Coulter who'd privately bet no civilian would break 140, counted out $1,000 in cash with stunned expression. Morrison, to his credit, approached Thomas and offered his hand, acknowledging he'd underestimated both the man and his method. Newspapermen descended like locusts, demanding to know everything about the two-nail rangefinder. One asked if Thomas had any formal education. When Thomas replied he'd attended school through 5th grade, the reporter wrote that down with visible excitement, already composing the story of the uneducated homesteader who'd humiliated Army marksmen with bent nails and pine. The Montana corporal asked if he could measure the nail board and copy its design. Thomas not only agreed but spent an hour explaining the full theory, trigonometry, importance of consistent arm extension, calculation method, sources of error, and how to minimize them. By evening, several men were sketching their own designs, and Army officers were discussing whether the principle could be standardized for training. What happened next revealed something about military bureaucracy and innovation. The Army invited Thomas to report for advanced marksmanship training. He spent 3 months at a California facility where they were developing sniper doctrine based on European experience. He taught his ranging method to instructors, demonstrated it repeatedly, and helped create a standardized version using a manufactured bore with precision-placed sights. The design worked beautifully. It was cheap to produce, required minimal training, and gave results comparable to optical rangefinders at a fraction of the cost. Several officers championed its adoption for training or for issuing to designated marksmen who couldn't carry bulky optical equipment, but the recommendation died somewhere in the procurement process. Official Army doctrine acknowledged improvised range-finding techniques, and some training materials mentioned geometric methods using simple instruments, but the standardized nail board never became official equipment. The reasons were never explicit, but veterans would recognize them. Institutional inertia, preference for established suppliers, reluctance to admit expensive optical equipment wasn't always necessary, and perhaps subtle discomfort with the idea that an uneducated homesteader had solved a problem that engineers and military theorists had addressed with complex solutions. Thomas returned home after training, too old for combat deployment, but certified as an instructor. He spent 1918 teaching rifle marksmanship at a Montana training camp, where he quietly taught his ranging method to anyone interested. Many students went to France carrying knowledge of how to estimate range with simple tools. Some certainly made their own nail boards from battlefield salvage. But officially, the technique remained unofficial, passed soldier to soldier rather than issued top-down. Thomas himself never sought glory for the invention. When the war ended, he returned to Wyoming, used his $1,000 winnings to improve his homestead, and went back to ranching. He died in 1954, largely forgotten outside his county, his name appearing in local papers only as an obituary noting military service and his reputation as an exceptional hunter. The newspaperman who'd covered the 1917 shooting competition had written a feature article, but it ran in a regional paper with limited circulation and was never picked up nationally. The story of the two-nail rangefinder survived primarily as word of mouth among riflemen, a clever technique some used and others had never heard of. But the principle Thomas discovered never went away. The geometric range-finding method he'd reduced to 2 bent nails was fundamentally sound, based on the same triangulation mathematics that surveyors' transits, artillery spotting, and even modern laser rangefinders use. What made Thomas's version remarkable wasn't new physics. It was that he'd stripped the principle to absolute essentials and made it accessible to anyone with basic arithmetic and simple materials. In an era when precision instruments were expensive and required technical expertise, he'd proven precision was possible with poverty and ingenuity. During the Depression years, when countless families faced the same desperation the Harkers had known, improvised rangefinders based on Thomas's design reappeared, passed between hunters and rural marksmen who needed every shot to count. World War II saw the technique resurface among soldiers who'd learned it from Depression-era hunters or older veterans who'd trained with Thomas. No official manual described it in detail, but snipers and designated marksmen in Pacific jungles and European forests sometimes carried crude versions, scratched measurements on rifle stocks, or carved notches in equipment, applying geometric principles when optical rangefinders were unavailable or impractical. The irony is that modern technology has made Thomas's solution obsolete while simultaneously validating his insight. Today's laser rangefinders give instant, precise distance measurements at a button press. Compact enough for a pocket, affordable enough that recreational hunters routinely carry them. But they all operate on the same fundamental principle Thomas understood. Measuring distance requires either knowing signal speed and timing its return, or knowing a baseline distance and measuring angles. Thomas's nail board used a second method, just as surveyors and artillery spotters did. Technology has changed from bent nails to laser diodes, but underlying geometry remains identical. A modern Army sniper using a laser rangefinder to engage a target at 600 yards is fundamentally doing what Thomas did with pine and nails, apply mathematical principles to convert angular measurements into distance estimates. The sophistication of the tool has changed. The cleverness of the principle hasn't. What makes Thomas Harker's story significant isn't just that he invented a useful tool. It's what his invention revealed about innovation, necessity, and barriers between technical knowledge and practical application. The educated engineers and military officers who mocked his nail board possessed all the theoretical knowledge needed to create something similar. They understood trigonometry, optics, and ballistics far better than Thomas did, but they'd been trained to think of precision as something requiring precision instruments, something needing funding and manufacturing and official approval. Thomas, lacking education and resources, approached the problem from pure necessity. He needed to know distances. He couldn't afford expensive equipment. Therefore, he had to find a way to accomplish the former without the latter. His innovation came not from knowing more than experts, but from refusing to accept that poverty meant impossibility. He saw past the assumption that sophisticated tools required sophisticated construction, and recognized that sometimes the sophisticated part was a principle, not the implementation. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Wright brothers succeeded at powered flight partly because they weren't aeronautical engineers, constrained by prevailing theoretical assumptions. Jack Kilby invented the integrated circuit while working at a nearly deserted facility during company-wide vacation, lacking resources and supervision that might have steered him toward conventional approaches. Percy Spencer discovered microwave cooking because he was curious about a melted chocolate bar rather than dismissing it as irrelevant. Innovation often comes from the margins, from people who lack resources to do things the proper way and therefore must find another way entirely. Thomas Harker wasn't a brilliant physicist or trained engineer. He was a hungry teenager who needed to feed his family and had nothing to work with except clear thinking and scrap materials. The nail-bored rangefinder emerged from that desperation, proven on prairie ridges where failure meant empty stomachs, refined through seasons of trial and error where nobody was watching and nobody cared except the Harkers themselves. There's another layer to this story, one speaking to how we remember and value innovation. Thomas's nail-bored rangefinder never made him famous or wealthy beyond that single $1,000 prize. He never patented it. The principle was too simple and too old even if he'd understood the process. He never marketed it. He was a rancher, not an entrepreneur, and the technique spread by demonstration rather than commerce. He never received official recognition. The Army acknowledged his shooting skill, but not the method that enabled it. When he died, his obituary mentioned his competition victory, but not the innovation that made it possible. The nail bore itself, the actual pine bore with bent nails that hit 5 targets at 600 yards, probably ended up burned for firewood or rotted in a barn somewhere, unrecognized as historically significant. Today, no museum displays it. No historical marker commemorates where Thomas developed the technique. No engineering students study his work as a case in elegant simplicity. His name appears in no index of American inventors. The story survives mainly in oral traditions of Western riflemen, passed down as an example of frontier ingenuity, but rarely with accurate attribution. Why does this erasure happen? Partly it's class. Innovations from educated professionals working in laboratories or corporations get documented, published, patented, and preserved. Innovations from poor rural people solving practical problems often don't, even when equally clever and useful. Thomas Harker had no access to patent attorneys, technical journals, or institutional support. His innovation emerged in a social context where such things were unknown, and by the time anyone with resources to publicize it paid attention, the moment had passed. Partly it's biased toward complexity. We tend to valorize innovations seeming technologically sophisticated, requiring specialized knowledge or expensive materials. A nail-bored rangefinder is too simple to seem impressive, too crude to appear in museums alongside brass instruments and polished optics. We struggle to recognize that simplicity achieved through clear thinking is as worthy of respect as complexity achieved through engineering resources. And partly it's biased toward official channels. Because the Army never officially adopted Thomas's method, it exists in historical record only as a footnote, an interesting anomaly rather than a significant development. Innovations shaping official doctrine get remembered. Ones spreading informally through practical demonstration often vanish. If we distill Thomas's story to its essential lesson, it might be this: respect the principle, not just a tool. The educated men who laughed at his nail board were confusing instrument with insight. They saw crude construction and assumed crude thinking, when crude construction often reflects sophisticated thinking constrained by limited resources. The optical rangefinder they trusted was superior in convenience and precision, but operated on the same geometric principles as Thomas's bent nails. The difference was manufacturing quality, not conceptual sophistication. By focusing on what the tool looked like rather than how it worked, they missed the point entirely. Thomas understood triangulation, angular measurement, and ballistic compensation, as well as any officer with a rangefinder. He simply implemented that understanding with materials costing 2 cents instead of $50. The mockery came from people who couldn't see past surface appearance to underlying competence. And when his shooting at 600 yards forced them to see, when results made mockery impossible, they had to confront their own assumptions about what poverty and lack of formal education actually meant. This confrontation between assumption and reality plays out constantly. How often do we dismiss ideas because they come from the wrong source, because presentation isn't polished, because the person proposing them lacks credentials we've been taught to respect? How often do we assume expensive solutions must be better than cheap ones, that complexity indicates quality, that formal training guarantees competence? Thomas Harker's 5 shots at 600 yards should remind us these assumptions are often wrong. The homesteader with bent nails outshot Army marksmen, not despite his crude equipment, but because he understood principles the Army had merely memorized. He developed his technique through years of practice under conditions where failure had consequences, not just scores. He'd refined his method through iteration and necessity, not just instruction. The competition didn't reveal that his nail bore was surprisingly effective. It revealed that effectiveness comes from understanding and skill, and tools are just tools, whether they cost 2 cents or $50. In the years after Thomas died, his family preserved some possessions, including what they believed was the original nail board from the 1917 competition, though they weren't entirely certain. One grandson, a Korean War veteran who'd learned both his grandfather's ranging technique and modern military methods, tried to interest the Smithsonian in acquiring it during the 1980s. The museum politely declined, noting they couldn't verify its authenticity or historical significance, and that improvised tools were generally not within their collecting scope unless connected to documented major events or figures. The nail bore remained in a Wyoming barn, and whether it still exists today is unknown. This curatorial decision was probably defensible by museum standards, but reflects the same bias that led officers to mock Thomas initially. The assumption that significance requires pedigree, that objects matter because of who made them rather than what they represent. A crude pine board with bent nails, even if it demonstrably accomplished remarkable things, doesn't fit comfortable categories. It's not folk art, not exactly military equipment, not sophisticated enough to be technology. It falls between classifications, orphaned by its own simplicity. Yet that orphaned simplicity is precisely what makes the nail board worth remembering. In an age of increasing technological complexity, where solutions often require expensive equipment, specialized knowledge, and institutional support. Thomas Harker's rangefinder stands as a reminder that principles are powerful, that understanding matters more than apparatus, that necessity can drive insights that comfort and resources might miss. The 2 bent nails that let him hit 5 targets at 600 yards weren't magic. They were applied geometry, mathematical relationships given physical form in the cheapest possible implementation. They worked because Thomas understood what he was doing, because he thought clearly about the problem, because he refined his technique through practice. The nails were just nails. The board was just board. The sophistication was in Thomas's head, in knowledge he'd acquired through desperation and curiosity, in his refusal to accept that poverty meant powerlessness. This is a story that should endure, not just that Thomas Harker won a shooting competition, though he did, not just that he invented a useful tool, though he did, but that he proved, in a way that couldn't be argued with, that ingenuity can outshoot wealth, that clear thinking can outperform expensive equipment, that the laughter of educated men means nothing when measured against results at work. The rifle cracks that echoed across Wyoming prairie in August 1917 weren't just hitting targets. They were shattering assumptions about who gets to innovate, about what innovation looks like, about whether formal education and institutional resources are prerequisites for solving hard problems. They were proving that sometimes the best answer is the simplest one, and that the simplest answer often comes from people who couldn't afford anything more complicated. Thomas Edwin Harker deserved better than historical obscurity. But perhaps it's not too late to remember that 2 rusty nails, aligned correctly and understood properly, could hit 5 targets at 600 yards, and in doing so could teach lessons about capability and resourcefulness that remain relevant in any era, any technology, any circumstance where problems need solving and resources are scarce. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him,